Today, I'm very happy that we can, for the first time, co-organize a panel discussion with all of you today with the Social Science Data Lab at the University of Mannheim. And let me look at my cheat sheet. The Social Science Data Lab is an event series at the Mannheim Center for European Social Research that provides a platform for early career researchers to present tools and methods for the collection, management, analysis, and visualization of data in the social sciences. And today is our very first hybrid event as well for the GESIS Meet the Experts series. And so we have you here, which is great, and we have you online. Today's discussion is on data quality. It's a very important focus at GESIS, and the dimension that we are tackling today is representation. In terms of the structure, so we are going to have the discussion first, and later on, after the discussion, after around 50-60 minutes, we are going to have questions from you, from the audience here, but also online. Online later on, you can raise your hands or also put the questions in the chat, and we will make sure that your question arrives at the panel here. And with this, I would like to introduce our moderators, both from the University of Mannheim and from GESIS. So we have from GESIS Jessica, who's the project coordinator of the Codex project. It's a project which focuses on building data competence in the social sciences. And her research explores the effects of diverse sampling strategies, mode and device effects in surveys, data donations, and data quality concepts. And we have Ruben. Ruben is a computational social scientist in the Data and Methods Unit of the MZES here at the University of Mannheim. He tackles questions of online use, media consumption, AI-guided decision-making, and quality aspects of novel data products. And he's also the co-host of the Social Science Data Lab. And as such, we're having you here both today. And he's also the co-editor of the blog Methods Bites. So with this, I would like to pass on to our moderators, and the floor is yours, please.
Great. Thank you very much. So I will start with a very brief introduction statement on the topic. And the observation we made is that a lot of survey research these days is based on non-probability samples. The advantages of such samples are obvious. Thousands of responses can be realized and collected in short time and at very low costs. However, even for those who are used to work with survey data, it's not always clear whether a given sample is good or bad, and for which questions which sampling designs work best. Moreover, it's sometimes difficult to assess the quality of a sample. So what is good, what is bad? Sometimes we may ask ourselves questions like, can I claim my sample is representative of the population? What does representative even mean? Should we avoid this term altogether? And how can I ensure that I accurately describe my sampling design and my data? To shed some light on these questions and some of the concerns, we will discuss the nuts and bolts of representation and sampling, including the notion of good representation, ways to achieve and measure it, challenges on the way towards good representation, probabilistic and non-probabilistic samples, and innovative ways to supplement traditional survey data. And I now head over to Jessica, who will introduce our international panel of experts in survey statistics and methodology.
Yes, thank you, Ruben. We are thrilled to have great experts here, and I'm going to start with here, my left, with Henning. Dr. Henning Silber is a survey operation team leader at GESIS, specializing in survey methodology and data quality. His work focuses on development and validation of innovative survey techniques to improve the accuracy and reliability of social science data. He will soon start as assistant professor at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And congrats from our side for this. And next in the row is the great Stephanie Eckman. She's a researcher and data scientist specializing in the research into data quality and data collection methods at the University of Maryland. She holds a PhD in survey methodology from this university, and her research interests include sampling methods in challenging environments and the combination of surveys and other forms of data. She has taught several courses on sampling, design data all around the world, and also at GESIS training, for instance, at GESIS Science. Yes. Next is sitting also great person from GESIS, Dr. Barbara Felderer. She's head of the survey statistics team at GESIS since 2019. Her research focuses on survey methodology, particularly the quality of survey data, non-response bias, and measurement error. Additionally, she specializes in survey statistics with an emphasis on methods of causal machine learning and the application to improve survey quality. And here, last in the row is Professor Peter Lugtig from Utrecht. He studied political science at the University of Amsterdam and completed a PhD in survey methodology at Utrecht as well. He currently works as an associate professor in dissection methods and statistics at Utrecht University, where he specializes in survey methodology and the use of sensor technology in smartphones. He currently serves as the head of this section. So I will now hand over to Ruben again to start our discussion.
Yeah, we'll jump right in with, I think, one of the most interesting questions for audience and also to discuss with the panelists. So to somehow set the stage, we want to talk about representation in probabilistic and non-probabilistic samples. And we made the observation that from time to time, we hear from survey methodologists and statisticians that they are very unhappy with the term representativeness. Can you tell us a little bit about this discussion and its connection to probability and non-probability sampling? And I think we could start with Barbara and Stephanie. Barbara?
Yeah, so thank you. So we realized that researchers publishing their results from their surveys or journalists talking about the results in newspapers, they like to call this survey representative. And in a way, meaning that this data is of good quality and that we can infer from the respondents to the general population. So this is all valid and good. And there's this big debate of how, whether they are allowed to do this or not, and who is allowed to call their data representative. Are non-prob surveys ever representative? And from a statistical point of view, it's important to know that representativeness is not a defined term in any way. So it's not a statistical term, it's not defined. So, and this is why statisticians often don't want to use this term anymore, because it's meaningless. It's just a buzzword that is meant to reassure readers that this is a good survey, but it might be not. And especially for non-prob surveys, we don't know. So often we read in newspapers discussing these findings. This addition, the survey is representative for age and gender, for example. So what does it mean? It means that the weighted data probably matches the distribution of age and gender in the population. But this is nice, but what about all the other variables? We don't know. So we can't tell this is good quality. And this is a big discussion about that.
Yeah, I definitely agree that representativity is not a well-defined term. In preparing for this, I did do a little bit of digging in the literature. I found a paper that went through like 6 or 7 different uses of this term from the literature. I myself have written a paper where I proposed maybe an 8th, so sorry, that probably wasn't useful. I mean, I think generally what the term is trying to capture is, does this sample match the population? And which is similar to what Barbara was saying. But what struck me in thinking about this is that does this sample match the population is a yes/no question, right? The person asking that question wants a yes or a no answer, which is really difficult to do because, of course, the term isn't well defined, but also because a lot of the measures that we do have to try to capture representativity, like the response rate or the fraction of the population that's observed, these are continuous measures. Right. And so how do you dichotomize that continuous measure into a yes/no answer? You might say, well, my study has a 90% response rate and yours only has a 40% response rate. But where's the line that you draw there between representative and non-representative? I don't think anybody has that figured out. Certainly a probability survey with like a 100% response rate, which I've never seen in my life. You know, that has a good claim to be representative of the population. Of course, you could always get a bad sample, right? Something could go wrong and you could get like only men or only people who live in East Germany or something like that, right? So even a probability sample like with 100% response rate, I would be, you know, you've got to put a confidence interval on that. You got to be careful, right? But when we have a probability sample, we have good statistical theory to put confidence intervals on our estimates. when the response rate starts falling from 100%, that theory becomes a little bit shakier. And again, I don't think there's any threshold at which you cross and you say, now we can't do standard inference methods because my response rate's too low. But probability selected sample, to address, I think, Ruben's question is, you have some good theory there, some good grounding to start to make inference to the population there, even if the response rate falls below 100%. With a non-probability sample, when people are just opting in, or you're taking whoever maybe you see on the street, then you don't have any of that statistical theory to fall back on. And that's when you really get into the models and the assumptions behind those models. And if we believe those assumptions, then we can make some inference in the non-probability surveys. But do we believe those assumptions? How do we test them? There's a lot going on there, and I've already probably spoken too much. So the only thing I want to say is that representativity is not a property of a sample, right? You can't say this sample is representative and this one is not. It has to do with like, what are you measuring? What's the variable you're interested in? Is it political participation, or is it likelihood to commit a crime, right? I mean, that's a given sample could be representative for one of those estimates and not the others.
Great, thank you. That is fantastic. We have a second question, which I think is also related and highly relevant. A lot of survey research these days, especially when we collect our own ad hoc survey data, is conducted using samples of the online population. So hardly anyone has the resources, except for like big survey projects, to do a survey of the general population. And so we all resort to online surveys. We were wondering whether you could tell us a little bit about whether online samples in general allow us to obtain results that generalize to the population, potentially including those who are not online. And maybe we'll start with Peter and Henning.
Yeah, well, so first of all, I think the reason why people do online surveys is not because the quality is so great. It's because it's so cheap and people are so easy to get. Right, so if you'd ask me, right, if you would focus on quality, there's probably better modes to go with. So that's first of all, I think something that is important about online surveys. And then you could of course say, well, maybe I'm for some reasons maybe you're more interested in an online sample, right, in an online population in general. Maybe you think, I don't know, if you do a special population survey. So let's say you focus on high school students, or you focus on employees of a company who are all online, right? Typically. Then of course you could say, well, I'm using an online survey and I probably, at least in theory, should be able to get everyone into my survey that I want to get into my survey. So there are ways, right, to do a proper or good online survey. And for the general population, right, if you want to do it very well, I think you have to rely on other methods other than online to get a good sample. So that means some offline recruitment as well. So there are methods called push-to-web surveys, where you try to recruit people offline, using, for example, sending paper invitations to people. And I think that's already a much better method to do surveys online. So it really depends what is the population that you're actually trying to study. And it also matters, I think, a lot on what you exactly do in the end, right? So how do you approach people? Do you have a special population, yes or no? And if you have a general population, right, what is it that you actually do in practice, whether that will allow you to do inferences to the population that you want to study?
I can continue and answer a bit your second question, whether you can generalize to the general population, also including most people who are not online. And generally would at first say no, because you can only generalize to the target population, which is included in the survey. But there are also some good news. More and more people get online. So we reach much more people than 10 years ago now, and that will probably continue. And however, the people who you don't reach, they have in some characteristics that are different from the people you reach. So they're probably older, the people you don't reach, they're less educated, they have less technical skills. So if those variables somehow correlate with your research interest, then that is a huge problem. If not, then maybe it's not such a big problem, and you might be able to generalize. You can also run some sensitivity analysis, for instance, using people who are not as often online, so you still get them in your survey, but you can run all analysis just with that group to see if they are different from other parts of the population. And then Peter already said there are some field strategies you can use, such as the push to web, or if a study has a lot of resources, that's probably not the case for most online studies, but for instance, the German Internet Panel used a method where they provided online access for people who are not online. So that is possible, but most likely not the way to go for many studies. Yeah, so far.
Thank you, Henning. Let's talk about more about assessment. So we were wondering how we do assess whether we have a good sample, be it prop or non-prop or not, and what are best practices to document this, for instance, in an academic paper. So Peter, do you want to start here?
Well, I think there are two ways to look at this. So you could look from the perspective of having a sample already collected and then saying how good is the sample that I actually have. So then you can use metrics like Stephanie already mentioned some of them, right? Using response rates or using benchmarks. So having some external data. And then typically what you see often is that people look at like the age distribution or the gender distribution. And I think good studies do more than that, right? So they look at better benchmarks that are closer to the actual outcome that you want to measure, right? So what is the statistical interest? But that's the one way to do it, right? To look at these benchmarks, basically. I think the other way to do it, and I think what is often the better way, is to take more of a process-oriented approach, right? So to look at the input side. So what do you actually do in the field? So even if you do a non-probability survey, I think there's a lot that you can do in documenting how you set up the survey. And I think that that's actually, so I'm not necessarily against non-probability surveys, but what I see happening very often is that people, when they do a non-probability survey, they don't focus very much on documenting what they do and how they do the survey. And I think that this is the big problem, that this process approach is missing a lot in the literature. So that's also what I see a lot in all kinds of market research, but even in academic research that tries to do things with non-probability survey. I really think that's an area where we are missing things.
Ella, do you want to add?
Yeah, so I fully agree. So even for a data set at hand, I want to know how it has been collected. So how did this data come about, and how have individuals been recruited, and this needs to be documented in any scientific paper. And what did the sample look like? Has there been a sample, or was it just everyone who was willing to participate? And if it was a sample, was it random? Was it a quota sample? What did researchers do to get to the survey, and which mode has it been conducted? So this might be important to know which groups are missing, and how much effort was put into reaching all of the individuals who have been sampled. And what group is the survey meant to represent? And this is important to judge the quality, knowing who should the data speak for.
Okay, I have a question that is, I realize now, very related to what we already just heard from you guys. So when we designed this interview for you, we thought of it would make sense to ask what questions come to your mind when someone tells you they did a survey in relationship to sampling, for example. And I think a lot of this was already answered, but maybe there's something to be added. Otherwise, we'll just go to the next one.
I wouldn't mind saying a little bit about that. Yeah, I think so. If somebody says to me that they've done a survey, how would I try to evaluate the quality of that? I mean, in terms of investigating the sampling approach, I feel strongly that a good sample should always be stratified by something. Whenever I teach sampling, which I've done at the ACS summer school in Cologne and all around the world, I always try to hammer that point home, right? That you should always be stratified by something. The best stratification variables are ones that relate to what you're measuring in the survey. So if you're measuring the labor force participation, you'd want to measure things like perhaps gender or region or family structure or something like this. You'd love to stratify by those kinds of variables. Of course, we're often limited in what we can stratify by because we need to have the variables available on the frame, right? But even if the variables on the frame, you don't think there's any real way that those are related to what you're measuring, I would stratify by them anyways. And this is what I tell all my students, because a poor stratification variable that doesn't have a strong relationship, it isn't going to cause any problems, right? But if there's any relationship there, stratification is going to make your standard error smaller. And that's why it's always a good idea. Like proportional stratification, I tell my students, is always a good idea. And so for me, that's a marker of like, have you selected a high quality sample or not? Did you stratify by anything? Did you find something to stratify by? But then I think, and this gets to what Peter and Barbara were saying, I think there's a lot of other quality markers that aren't about the sampling at all, but that I would still look to. So for example, the data collection, and Barbara touched on this, but you mentioned equal effort, I think. And so I want to just hammer that point because I think I see a lot that somebody puts a lot of effort into the sample design and then doesn't follow through in the data collection. Like, oh, we ran out of data collection money towards the end of the field period. So some people only got like one letter or they only got one call or something like that, right? Better would be that all people get the same treatment. All selected panel members or sample members get the same inputs and recruitment work, right, put into them so that they all have a chance to respond. And so that always makes me sad. And that to me is a marker of like, oh, I'd be a little bit worried about this sample or this survey when I see that the data collection protocols weren't applied evenly throughout the field period, which often, I mean, it just happens a lot, but that's something I always look for. Anything to add?
Can I follow up? Because there may be some confusion between the concepts of photo sampling or like non-probability samples with photos and stratified sampling.
Okay.
Could you in a few words just kind of point out the differences between the two concepts?
Sure. So stratification is done before data collection while you're selecting the sample. So for example, say an employee survey. If you were going to select a sample of employees of the University of Mannheim, for example, right? You could just do a simple random sample. If you worked in the HR office, right, you probably have a list and you could do a simple random sample and that would be a valid sample. It'd be scientific and all and representative, whatever that means. But you probably have variables there you could stratify on, like the PLZ code of where the employees live or what department they work in, right? Or how long they've been at the university. And so those are all variables that you could stratify on. And what stratification does is it eliminates some of the really weird bad samples. So I think my first answer, I said, you select a sample and you can get like all men, right? Well, if you stratify by gender, you're definitely not going to get all men. You're going to get a proportional allocation to the different genders.
And quota sampling in relation to non-prop or in non-prop samples?
Yeah, you know, I don't know if I've ever worked on a quota sample, but it involves sort of during data collection. You give, the way I've seen this done most often is like with interviewers, or I guess you could do this online as well. Does somebody else want to take the quota sample question?
I can say something about it. So it's basically it's not done randomly. The people just come in the survey, mainly like for instance for online panel or other things, and then you have certain quotas. For instance, you want 50-50 female and male respondents, and as soon as you have a quota full, like 50% women already, then all other women get screened out. So it's exactly the opposite what Stephanie said, that everyone has like the same chance to take part. You just want to have your quotas filled, but you don't want the actual sample frame represented.
Okay.
And the problem is that this sample, that at the end it looks good because it's 50% women, 50% men, but all the women who came after this 50% have been fulfilled. They have zero chance of participating.
Great, thanks. Henning, do you want to add something to the
or more general topic? Yeah, maybe I can add something that I think is very important, is also related to this quota sampling question, which is the self-selection. So in, I would say in high quality surveys, you select basically the people from the sample frame, whereas in lower quality, cheaper samples, people come to the survey organization or through some other way in a panel or on an online link to participate. And those have often different attitudes, different behaviors, so they are often just a little bit a subgroup of a general population, and that limits, of course, generalizability.
Thanks.
Thank you for this. Yes, my next question concerns researchers doing research with big data sets of work, self-collected data sets. How can researchers assess whether estimates from their data can be trusted, or how can they decide which of several survey data sets, for instance, cases data archive, you have several data sets, to be preferred? Maybe Barbara, you want to start here.
Yeah, so first, as Stephanie said, the quality of the estimate is really variable specific. So the same data set might be of good quality for some characteristics and of bad quality for other characteristics. So what people first look at is response rates, which is a bad indicator, which you've already said. I mean, not meaningless, but the same survey can be, like, low response rate surveys can be good, and the other way around. So what I like to do is compare my data set, my sample composition to official benchmarks. So I know from the statistical offices how many women, men, age groups, educational groups, and so on live in Germany, and we can compare our distributions from the survey to these benchmarks to get some impression of whether we missed some groups entirely or if some groups are highly underrepresented in the survey. If we don't have the data from the official statistics, we could use benchmark surveys that we know are really high quality, like probability-based, face-to-face surveys could be used as a gold standard to compare our findings to. The problem, of course, is that all the things that we want to analyze in our data set usually hasn't been collected before or not for the same population, so we would need a survey. So these are always indirect ways of looking at bias. So as Peter said, we need to look at benchmarks that are highly correlated, probably, to the things that we want to look at. And then if we don't find bias in these variables, we might hope that there's no bias in the things that we are looking at and the variables we're really interested in. Yeah.
Stephanie, do you also want to add here?
Yeah, I agree with everything Barbara said. I mean, I think this question is of, how do we measure how good a survey is super tricky, super important, but I don't think we have any good answers yet. If I were looking at the BASIS archive or another archive like that, I would look at the quality of the documentation, as I think that's a good proxy for data quality. So the American Association of Public Opinion Research has a transparency initiative where firms, data collection firms, can join, and they agree to be very open about their data collection methods, the sampling methods, the data collection methods, weighting, everything, all phases of the project. And research has shown that firms that are members of the Transparency Initiative do a better job in, say, election polling. Now, it's not the actual transparency itself, like the act of supplying that information doesn't make them better, but the firms that sign up to be transparent are the ones that are already doing higher quality work, right? So that to me suggests that this documentation process, it can be a proxy for data quality. I would also look to see if the sample has weights on it, like weights representing the probability of selection, and then weights representing any sort of non-response adjustment. The presence of those on a data set to me suggests that statisticians were involved, they understand sampling and how it works, and so that would be another marker to me. And then just to build off what Barbara was saying, I think she's right that oftentimes the benchmark you wished you had for your survey doesn't exist. It's not collected in the census or any of the large, high quality face-to-face surveys, right? But so the benchmark that you wish you could have, you don't have. But what you can do, and I think we were talking before we got online, and Peter mentioned Andrew Mercer, who works at Pew Research Center, who has done a good job of asking questions in the survey in order to match the benchmark, right? So if there's a benchmark available in a high quality survey that you think might be related to the variables you're measuring, then you can ask that question in your survey in order to benchmark it. And I think that's a really nice approach that he's used and that I'd like to see others use as well.
Can I add to this? So I very much agree that just the presence of documentation and good documentation, right? So how elaborate it is already really a good quality criterion, I think. And what I'm always looking for in a survey is whether, like, thinking about what are the difficult groups in a particular study. So if you're doing a study around, say, politics or something like that, what is going to be the difficult group? Well, the people that are not interested in politics or that don't vote, right? We know this. So then I read the documentation, and I think, what did this survey do to actually attract those people into the survey? Right? So did they follow up on those people? Did they oversample, right? So did they stratify on, say, level of education or something like that? Did they do extra effort, right, for these kind of respondents, for example? And if I find hints of these kind of things, then I'm usually quite happy. And if I find nothing, then I'm like more doubtful. Doesn't say that it's necessarily bad, but I'm just a bit of a cynic in that sense, and then I'm thinking like, well, probably not a very good survey.
Okay. We have another question that touches on probability and non-probability sampling. And we were wondering, what are the biggest challenges for the two types of sampling strategies? Maybe you could talk a little bit about this. That's Henning, maybe you want to start.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So let's first talk about probability sampling. So one big issue is the response rates. They've been going down for the last decades, basically. Now Germany is always very low, also in the European comparison, with like 20–30% often in like even high quality surveys. So that's a huge problem. Also the costs. Everything in research and in daily life gets more expensive, and particularly also surveys, especially when considering the decreasing response rates. For non-probability surveys, I would say the generalizability issues, the self-selection. There's also something, a term that is called professional respondents, that people kind of make at least a bit of their income from taking part in surveys, and sometimes are registered in multiple panels, don't take the survey so seriously. I know it's not everywhere the case, but it's something to watch out for if you use online panels. That can happen. Yeah. And yeah, there are also more general trends that are like relevant for both, which is that there's over-surveying. So there are much more surveys done than ever before, and that also, of course, somehow affects willingness to participate, quality, and so on. That is a problem. And yeah, also something like declining trust in research, which is particular, I think, also in the United States a problem, but I think everywhere around the world. And yeah, if people don't trust research, they also don't trust survey research. Yeah, and that's a big issue that we have to deal with as survey researchers.
So when we start our research process, we have some idea for a paper, some hypothesis that we want to test. First step would be to see if there's already data out there. That is what I take from your concern of over-surveying.
That is certainly helpful to see what is there. Just also in terms of quality, you want to build on what is there. So if someone has like tested measures and so on, so you would want to use them. And so you anyway have to do the work to see what is there, and if you can use the data either completely or in addition to what you want to collect, and it's obviously very good. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think here it's nice actually to separate the two, probability and non-probability surveys. So what Henning says, I agree with. For probability surveys, I also see a challenge in getting good lists, right? So good probability samples all start from a list. Getting access to these lists, there's more and more information nowadays about everyone everywhere, but like getting access to that and also having that frame be up to date, that I see as a challenge in many countries, at least in Europe. I think then a probability survey, when it's done traditionally, this documentation part is all usually done quite well. For non-probability surveys, this is where I see the biggest challenge in the fact that it's where do the respondents come from, right? And how is the survey actually being conducted? That is the biggest challenge that is generally, I think, just not very well described. And also like to call ourselves out a bit. We also don't have really good guidelines for what to do there, and how to actually describe the whole survey process for a non-probability survey, which is also very hard, right? Because once we usually get involved, both the data are already there, right? You have to actually trace every step of how these people actually got into the survey. And that's actually sometimes really very hard to do that. But this is, I think, a place where we can just put more effort.
And can I add one question on response rates? We talked a little bit about response rates and declining response rates being a big problem for probability surveys. Could you tell us, anyone in the panel, a little bit about the relationship between response rates and response bias?
Yeah. Well, so there's been a study that's already from Groves and Pejeva from 2008, so it's already a little bit dated. It's kind of like the pre-internet era almost, although 2008 we had internet. But anyway, so they had a study where they looked at they used these kind of benchmarks. So they collected studies and they looked at studies that had good benchmarks. So often these were, for example, medical studies where hospitals would do surveys among patients and they would know things about the patients, right? So they have a lot of data. And then in the survey, they kind of ask the same thing again, and then they actually have good benchmarks there. So then they can look at the relationship between what kind of response rate do we actually get and what kind of bias do we get. And there they found that the relationship between the two was actually quite weak. So yes, if you get a better response rate, it generally means there's a little bit less bias, but it's not necessarily so. I think Barbara already said this, right? So it's not so that if you get a very bad response rate that your survey is bad, or if you get a good response rate that your survey is very good in terms of the bias, and that relationship is really not very strong. Right, so I think there's also more to it, right? So if you think a little bit more carefully about this, response rate is just one metric, right? It's one outcome metric, and it summarizes this whole process of how you got your respondents into one number. That's already simplifying things a lot, right? So I think it kind of also makes sense that this relationship is not super strong, but there is a relationship, right? So it is still, I think, the case that generally surveys with a better response rate also will have less bias overall.
Yeah, and the response rate, I mean, it's important that the respondents and the non-respondents, they are similar in a way, and the higher the response rate is, the less possibly difference there is usually. So it makes sense, but it's not that important how many people do respond, but why do they respond and why do they not respond? Is there a systematic difference between them?
One interesting aspect about response rate is also that some people, even though when they talk about non-probability surveys, they even don't use the term response rate, because it's always often self-selection and maybe some pool, but when they say who participated from a pool, so they call it participation rate to make this distinction that it's not like a list with a random selection. Yeah?
And thank you. If I may jump in here on non-probabilistic sampling approaches, I have a question here for Barbara. So for what kind of research questions, for what kind of research designs are non-prob panels or non-probabilistic data appropriate? And to put it around, when do I definitely need prob-based sampling?
Yeah, so it's really important what I want to do with the data to decide whether the non-prob is sufficient. And always when I want to transfer my findings to the general population, like all German residents or all pupils in a school, whatever I have as a target population, I would not recommend using non-prob data. So as Stephanie said, statistical theory doesn't hold anymore, but there's so much selectivity going on. We know that for non-prob data that we can't use it to generalize to the population. There are benefits of non-prob data as they are cheap and timely, so we can use them to test survey questions like wording and all that, test questionnaires, do a pre-test, or we can use them to generate hypotheses that we then afterwards can test on a prob survey. The non-prob surveys are usually frequently used for experimental data, like on student samples or like in psychology. And this might be valid if the treatment effect is homogeneous. So if everyone, like some have a treatment, randomly get a treatment, the others don't. And if everyone reacts the same way to this treatment, then we can generalize the non-prob findings to the general population. But this is a strong assumption that carefully needs to be made. Or hard to reach groups. If you don't get access to these groups in any prob way because there are not that many on a list or whatever, it might be really important to get them in a non-prob survey and get some idea about this group, but still not generalize these findings to the whole group. That would not be valid.
And if I may jump in here, are all non-prob sampling approaches equally good or bad, or can you say something on the ranking, or I don't know. I mean, it's open to everybody, but yes.
I would say that there's a big variety. I can't tell you which method is better than or not, but we find that some non-prob surveys are quite good for the things that we are measuring. Some are not. Some are good for some measure and not good for the others. So you never know. So you get this data set and you don't know. You don't know if you can trust it or what you can trust it. So yes, and everything that's online obviously does not include people who don't use the internet. So and so yeah, they have there, and yeah, there's a big variety. You can find that, and we also know that they're especially bad for univariate statistics, and you can find that some correlation measures or even multivariate measures they're not that bad, but also we can never know.
I want to say, like, there are some non-probabilistic methods that I think are really very promising, and especially so when we know that probability-based surveys do really badly. So if you look for specific hard-to-reach groups, like isolated groups in society, for example, hard to find people, then sometimes non-probability sampling methods just do maybe even a better, or at least a much easier and quicker job of finding these particular groups. And I think this whole network approach, so there's this respondent-driven sampling and river sampling and all kinds of different approaches. I think that it's not been worked out completely, right? It's not, and also there the quality is very variable, but I think personally it is a very promising method.
What I like to recommend is not even only with non-prob samples, but especially there, is to use more than one sample. So, and the best would be even recruited for a different way or so. So if you aim at like generalized good results and it shows up multiple times, then it might be indication that there's like strong relationships in there. But I mean, you should anyway with non-prob surveys probably not look at distribution and try to generalize them. But if you test some relationships and they appear multiple times, then it could be something that would likely also show up in a probability survey.
Perfect transition to the next question, right?
Yeah. So we have a final question, which talks a little bit about digital behavioral data. And I want to open the question and make it a little bit broader, like new technology in general. So we've seen like digital data being used in the social sciences, anything from donated data, tracking data, sensor data, anything you can think of. And we see analysis techniques, machine learning. I think earlier we heard that Barbara is specialized in causal ML for survey research. And I would like to know what does this mean for representation? Can we use these data, these tools of these analytical tools in complementing and adding missing pieces to the puzzle? Very open question to all of you, I guess. Peter, Stephanie, I don't know.
Yeah, okay, well, I mean, I think especially a couple of years ago when a lot of social media were still open, most social media data was still openly available, like Twitter, for example, you saw a lot of people using this as a tool for doing social research. So doing, whatever, right? Or kind of like the traditional opinion polling and then using Twitter as a replacement for that. That's not used as much anymore, and that's partly because access to Twitter has been restricted. but also because I think it's just not a way to go. It's not a good way, right? If you look at Twitter users, right, and you look, so people who are on Twitter nowadays, but even already 5 years ago, you have a very selective subset of the population. And then you look at the people who actually post on Twitter, which is a subset of the people who are on Twitter. And then you look at who posts very often, right? And there you have a subset. So you have an incredibly selective subset of people. That's very different on all kinds of metrics from the people that you're typically interested in. So I think that that's just not a way to go. And I know that this is a very, this is a unique example. There's lots of different sources out there on the internet, but I think this is very often the basic problem of these kind of found data. That is not to say that these data are not interesting, right? They're very interesting. But I think that the way to go would be to actually combine these kind of data with, let's say, more traditional way to do surveys. So, for example, what you can do is you start with a normal survey, you do your survey, and then you try to link to these kind of digital behavioral data. That's an approach that's being used by many different people, and with some success, I think, already. So I think that that's a much more promising.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. The problem with coming, as you started out talking about, when you go directly to the social media sites and you try to scrape that kind of data or get access to that kind of data, the problem there is that you don't know anything about the people often, right? You don't have their gender or their age or anything related to that. And so the data sets are kind of, there's a lot of information there, but not necessarily the variables that we're used to dealing with as social scientists. So the way around that then is to start with a sample of people, and that might be a probability sample or a non-probability sample, collect the background data that you want, and then ask for permission to go out and get data from Instagram or whatever platform you might be interested in. So that can be really useful and insightful, and I've seen some interesting studies based on that kind of data. The problem is then you've got a sort of another layer of selection, right? You can start with a excellently designed probability sample, you recruit people into the survey, you lose a good portion of them there, right? The response rate is going to be not ideal for that. But then you also then, of those who participate, you ask for permission to link in some of these other data sources. And of course, the participation rate there is also not 100%. So you're opening the door for another layer of selection bias. And so that's something that worries me. I'm thinking about what was the actual question. So what does this mean for representation? One thing I haven't seen, and I'm not as up on this literature as I probably should be, but one thing I haven't seen is, could you kind of come at this from both directions, right? Could you merge in from your recruited sample information about, you know, their Garmin devices or something like this, right? But then also go to Garmin and say, hey, can we get some benchmarks from you guys so that we know how far off we are with our sample? That might be a way in which you could try to improve the quality of the data that you're not making the data better, right? But you could then benchmark the Garmin data you have from your users against what you get from Garmin and try to improve the representativity of the data. I haven't seen that done, but that sounds like something to try. Did you want to say something as well? I thought you were.
Yeah, it goes a little bit in the same direction. So I have seen a study where there was web tracking data, and when they somehow the contact of those people and asked them to take part in the survey. So it was basically the other way around that we usually do. But still, I also completely agree that the combination of this data is probably the way forward, or at least to get some benchmark information from that digital behavioral data.
I think there's a slightly different mechanism. When you're asking someone to participate in a survey, you're really asking them to like sit down and talk to you or fill out the web form for 10 minutes or so, right? And people are busy and not everyone wants to do that. But if you ask someone to donate or otherwise contribute data from their phones or their devices or their online social media, different people might be interested in doing that, right? So I think there's a little bit of a different mechanism for survey completion versus data donation or data contribution that might help fill in some of the holes that are missing in the other one.
And coming back to your machine learning, I think the algorithm can never heal bad data. I mean, this is of course we do all these weighting stuff that Stephanie already mentioned to be able to mitigate non-response bias in a way, but still we depend on the data as well. We need to have good benchmarks and all that. And the usual finding is that the algorithm that isn't that important, it's the data that is important.
So machine learning and AI and all the hype is not like our hope to fix all the problems with the data.
Not this problem.
Yes, perfect. So for our last question, we have a kind of a case study. Imagine you want to conduct a survey on political participation and have a certain question here in mind, but due to limited resources, you cannot afford to create a fully probabilistic sample. And it turns out that you could not find any secondary data you could use. So given the current advancements in technology and data analytics, how would you proceed to ensure that your survey results are as representative and meaningful as possible? So in which direction would you go? Does somebody want to jump in here?
It's a difficult question.
I know.
I would in that case, right? If your budget is really limited or your time, I would typically go qualitative, right? So to do somehow more in-depth research with fewer people. So that budget-wise, that usually is a very effective way to reduce your budget. And in qualitative research, right, you have a very different way of looking at representativity, right? It's not so much to get 50% males and 50% females or whatever, right? You want to get diversity in your sample, right? So that's the core criteria then. So if it's about political participation, you want to make sure that you get voters from across the kind of political spectrum in your qualitative research.
Thank you. Does somebody want to add something?
So there are also approaches, I'm not expert in them, but to combine probability and non-probability data. So that could be also something that you get from some like key measures from the probability survey that kind of help you to benchmark things and so on. So that it's also something for a smaller probability sample and a larger non-probability sample. So it's also something to look into.
So thank you.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah.
We're good on time.
You're perfect on time. So now is the time for questions from you here, maybe also comments, and of course online. We've got 54 people listening till the end. Thank you so much for this. Nelly is going to organize and read out the questions or see if you raise your hands online. But also if you have some questions, comments, it's now the time for you. Of course, you can also ask kind of critical or questions, raise points.
Oh, we can start with a question from the chat. So one is on the value of big data or large sample sizes. So in the field of computational social science, people working with big data argue that the sheer sample size can help to tackle the problem of having a selective sampling process and do not have to care about the data generation process. Can this argument be made? Is the question.
There's a really nice paper by Zhaoli Meng from, I think it's 2018 or so, it's a while ago, who actually asked this exact question, right? So can the law of large numbers, right, big data, can that help? And I think he answers this quite convincingly that no, right? So the large numbers do not help, and in fact, they make matters worse.
I think they make matters worse often because we're so used to putting, we put confidence intervals on our estimates where the denominator of the width of the confidence interval is the sample size, right? So if you just calculate that very naively, sort of assuming the data that you have comes from a simple random sample, you put really small confidence intervals on your estimates and then which are not warranted necessarily. And so you're overly confident in these large sample sizes in ways that worry me.
So you've time to think about a question. I have a question now. A couple of times you mentioned benchmark surveys. I think they are suffering from the same problem, like non-response and declining response rates. So how do we deal with this when we want to see and assess our data quality?
So sometimes you can use benchmark from official statistics where people are required to take part. So they have much higher response rates, often over 90 and so on. So But of course, if you were to take just a probability survey as a benchmark survey, then you have a problem with non-response. Yeah.
Yeah, I also agree. I think this is a really big problem. I mean, Henning mentioned the lack of trust in science, which I think is behind a lot of the declining response rates. Certainly the ones that we have in the United States. I think people don't want to participate in surveys because they don't necessarily trust the government. What are you going to do with this data, right? And that really is a problem for all the benchmark surveys that we rely on in the US to benchmark all the others. Yeah, I'm worried about it a lot. You got solutions?
No solution. I just want to say yes, not every difference between my survey and the benchmark survey is really a bias. I mean, the benchmark might be biased as well. But maybe taking more than one benchmark and would help to see whether they agree on some estimates and then compare my benchmark to that.
There's another, oh yeah, then go ahead.
Yeah, you were talking about, sorry, I can't see the three of you at the same time, the four of you at the same time. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that you were talking about documentation of all the process. So I would like to ask, what do you recommend to document, in the sense that we don't have guidelines, as you were mentioning before, and how to also balance this with publishing, when with people, I mean, I usually struggle with words, you know, that you have to be as succinct as possible, but also you want to make visible that you have worked on this. So usually when I have published, I said I work with this panel that use points in this regard, and we use quotas, but I don't know if just by saying this is enough. I'm sure it's not. So how do you, what would be your advice in that sense?
I think there are a growing number of journals that will publish these kinds of data reports. And so, which I think changes the incentives a little bit, right? Gives researchers incentives to publish the documentation, because it counts then as a line in your CV and not as something that you have to do but you don't really care about and nobody's going to look at it, right? Some of the data repositories, like the ones at ISR, are probably the ones at GASIS, you know, require some documentation, right? And I think we've seen recently in the computer science world, a lot of these big benchmark data sets, right? Like ImageNet is the one that I think is the most popular, but there are many of these. They are seen as resources in their own rights, right? And so you get like professional cred from creating these data sets and documenting them. Although I think they haven't done as well in the documentation as they should. Anyway, I think I see the tide turning a bit, that the documentation is becoming more important and more, you get sort of, you get some credit for having done it.
I would certainly turn to the American Association for Public Opinion Research. They, in many ways, I think they are very advanced in terms of providing at least some guidance. And Stephanie has also mentioned the transparency initiative, and they have I think for any data collection or for actually reports of statistical findings, we have a list of requirements that you should report about the sample and how you derive to those estimates. And so that's, I think, a good place to start. And more and more journals, even outside the association, also refer to those standards and when inviting empirical research for their journals.
Yes, I have also a follow-up on what was said before, on a topic we slightly touched before. So we are losing more and more persons or individuals who recruit for our surveys. For instance, in Germany, the AfD voters, we are losing to get them into, or we are not succeeding in getting them into our surveys. And also to get then estimates from them. I'm wondering, like, what approaches do we have to either get them in our surveys or include them in our estimation process, having other data collection methods? And yes.
I think it's still possible to get So there are certain groups in the population which are just harder to get, right? So typical voters for political parties, lower educated people, and then say migrants or young males. And then you have these, if you combine all these elements, I don't know if that works, but I mean, yes. So you have these groups, and I think, but there are ways to do that have been around for a very long time. So following up people with different modes, reminders, incentives, we kind of know generally what works. What I am concerned about as well is now this, what I think is a new group, and I think in the US this is even more pronounced, right? A group that mistrusts science, research, institutes in general, and that is a group that is, I think, much harder to get, right? It's I don't know how large this group is in Germany or in Europe. Small, I think, still. But it's growing, and that's a thing I'm concerned with as well. Yeah.
So there are more questions in the chat. So first of all, thank you for the interesting talk. So far, I have a rough idea of matching procedures. For example, to compare online survey data with reported data using several characteristics in order to formulate statements on representativeness and derive considerations on generalizability. A lot of difficult words for me. So what do the panelists think of this approach?
Matching?
Yeah, matching procedures. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, matching is a nice method for trying to adjust your sample to look more like the population. There are several different methods of this type. Matching is one that I use often. You can only match on the variables that you have, right? That you have observed in your sample and also in the population. And so that's the limiting factor. It's not the method is a fine one. It's just whether you have the data available to drive it. It's a good idea to think in advance. What are the variables I'm going to want to match on, and then ask those questions in the survey so that you have them and can do the matching. I mean, Barbara says that AI is no sort of solution to the problem. I do think, I mean, I'd be interested to hear if you disagree, but I think some of the propensity score models that we were building 10, 15 years ago before the AI methods required a lot of sort of functional form assumptions that we now can get away from because we can just throw them all into a model, like a machine learning model, and it's more flexible and doesn't require that I specify all the interactions that might exist. And then, so to me, I feel like that's a small improvement that the models have made. Do you?
Yeah, I agree that the models, you don't have to specify all the models, and the models, like AI finds the model, but still it's, in my opinion, it's more important, as you said, to have the good variables to do it. And there might be some improvement by the method, but it's not as big as by adding additional variables that are information.
And sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to relate to Jessica's question earlier. I think if you don't have people in the sample, then all the matching doesn't help. So if you have no non-voters, then there's nothing to match to, even if you collected a variable.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, there's as you said, there's a connection between the assumptions that we make, say, with causal inference methods, with observational data, and matching methods for improving the quality of our data, where we don't understand the data generating processes so much. That right, like selection on observables, and you can only check for like benchmarks for where you have information available.
Right. There's a bunch of different methods like entropy balancing or machine or propensity score matching or actual variable matching. There's a lot of methods like this, but they all rely on this assumption, this selection on observables, that the only things that matter are the variables that we have, which is a fundamentally untestable assumption, because if we had the variables, we would use them.
So I have another question. A few years ago, Andrew Gellman criticized the position of APER's prop samples to the effect that even the prop samples with low response rates are actually non-prop samples, meaning we live in a world of non-prop samples. Is this defeatist position still valid, or is the positive view of prop samples invalid?
So where I disagreed with Andrew Gellman then, and still now, is that I think it's really, I made this point already, so sorry for the audience, but it's really about documentation, right? So yes, your probability sample can have a very low response rate, but if you document very carefully about what you did in the field to reach these people, and in the end, I don't know, you produce the survey weights in the correct way, you at least on the process part have a very good survey. And that is missing from the non-probability survey. And I think that's, so I would definitely trust the probability survey more in that case, still.
But of course, what is probability in the prop survey is the sample. And then all the processes after that non-response, they might lead to non-probability sample in a way, but it's only that's this step. But for a non-prop survey where everyone can respond, we have different selectivity steps, and they might be really different. So different characteristics might impact whether you see this advertisement or whatever for the non-prop survey. And then there's the self-selectivity. So there's much more going on. And so I totally agree. I would trust prop surveys more because they have this nice start with the sample.
As long as the probability survey is bringing in people who would never opt in, then it's increasing your.
Yeah. I mean, that's, yeah, you're right. I mean, that's, yes, you have to still do the probability survey in a good way, right? Yeah.
Are there comments or questions here?
I have another question. I reached over a lot of different media. So another question. Would you say that decreasing response rates have to be interpreted as decreasing data quality, and that we have to put more effort, for example, money, into traditional survey settings where there are no alternatives in sight, or when there are no alternatives in sight?
Answer that one. I mean, Peter talked about the lack of a strong relationship between the response rates and the non-response bias. And then you asked about the declining quality in the benchmark surveys. I mentioned the Pew Research Center earlier, out of Washington, D.C. One of the things that they did was launch their own benchmark survey because they felt that the variables that were available in the U.S. government surveys were not complete enough, right? So for example, the U.S. government has a policy of not asking religion. So if you wanted to use religion as a benchmark in your survey, you couldn't, you'd have to use one of the other non-governmental surveys which have lower response rates, right? So they did that themselves. It's an extremely expensive undertaking that most people can't do. I feel like I've gotten away from the question.
So, no, yeah, basically, are there any strategies to increase response rates, to put it in a positive way, maybe?
So a method that hasn't been used so much previously, but particularly through the pandemic, it increased is using the mail mode more, and I think people might be also not contacted so much by mail anymore. A lot of conversation is now online, so that might be something that is reoccurring, and it's also not necessarily expensive. So it's much cheaper than, of course, sending an interview somewhere.
I guess one thing that I feel like could perhaps be used more, maybe this is another area where AI could come in, is a lot of the big government surveys that I've worked on, they'll often do an experiment to begin. They'll try out like 2 or 3 different letters to recruit people via mail to participate in the survey. And then say like, oh, version C is the one that did best. We got the highest response rate to version C. So going forward, we're just going to use version C. But I mean, if I look out at the US or Germany or other countries, right, it feels like the population is getting sort of more, I'm not thinking of the right word, but like broken down, like
diverse.
Diverse, but like polarized, yeah, like put it into pockets, right? So like So why do we think that there's one letter that's going to work for all these different pockets of respondents, right? So could we tailor the contact materials before we even, the first time we even mail somebody or email somebody? Do we have any information about them with which we can tailor those contact materials? Well, it seems like Henning is the kind of guy who's going to respond because I said like, hey, help your community, you know, whereas Barbara's the person who's going to respond because I've said that this survey is going to improve the environment or something like that, you know what I mean? And so if we can tailor the messages in those ways, can we get higher response rates? I feel like we haven't done enough with that yet.
Question here?
Yeah, I have a question. So all of us probably knows about some instance where non-probability surveys or at least really bad surveys were reported in the newspapers and took off and were reported over and over. So is there any way reducing or even preventing this from happening?
I think this will just get worse.
Might be.
I don't want to be very deep there. I think one of the risks I see, and I've seen some surveys already doing this, is where they use generative AI to create like kind of like an artificial population. So you create 1,000 personas on ChatGPT and you give them some characteristics, and then you ask like, who would you vote for in the next German elections? And then you ask this to these 1,000 personas, and you get your opinion poll. And this is all still, I mean, people don't take this seriously, but this is all developing, and I can see this is basically a no-cost way, right? The costs for this are basically almost zero once you build the sample. And I can see this as a way for news outlets, for anyone, right, to do this kind of work. Anyone can do that. Anyone can set this up. And because we're in this world where there's this constant hunger for news and for items, I think that this will keep happening. Yeah.
I'm not that sure because I can see some awareness amongst journalists, like asking us how they could judge whether a survey has been good or not. So maybe there's a turnaround in that direction as well, because they get critical. That's my impression.
So we have a question following up on what Stephanie just said about tailored designs or addressing people differently. Doesn't this contradict the position to have maximize fieldwork homogeneity?
Yeah, I thought about that when I said it. Yeah, this is certainly a concern and something you need to look into, right? What is the ultimate? If the goal is to maximize response, then maybe the tailored approaches can get us there. But as we discussed, like that's not always the right thing to do in terms of overall data quality, right? Perhaps people recruited with an appeal towards the environment respond differently to the survey than people who are recruited with other kinds of appeals. So we'd have to look at that. By the equality in the data collection, I guess I more meant like the number of calls or the number of mailings or the number of follow-ups. And less so the wording, but yeah, that's a good point.
I think, oh, sorry.
Now you go.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to repeat what you always say. I think it's important to document it well, and when you do it, you can always control in your analysis for that. And I also think it's definitely good to try different ways to reach people that you want in the survey. And who are unlikely to respond. And I think that goes over standardizing everything.
Yeah, I think it's completely valid to do more for certain groups if you know that these groups are difficult, to do more contact attempts or to give them something extra, different letter. Because what you're looking for in the end, ideally, in the ideal world, is to have the response rate to be the same across all the relevant subgroups that you're surveying. And in order to get like equal response rate, you have to do more for some groups than for others.
And as you discussed, found data such as digital trace data may not be a replacement for survey data, but have you any ideas how this data can be better used to address the current challenges you mentioned, like lower response rates or targeting hard to reach groups?
I think that the problem is that people, I sort of said this earlier, if people aren't participating in surveys because they don't have the time, but they are willing to donate the data, then it can be a way that we diversify our samples. I'm also really interested in the idea that we get slightly different pieces of information, right? So I'm actually not wearing my smartwatch today, for once, but if you want to know how much somebody exercises, right, you can ask them questions about exercising, and people aren't great at answering those questions. They tend to over-report how much they exercise, right? So you might instead ask them to donate the data from their device, which isn't going to have the same social desirability bias. The device isn't going to overstate because it wants to protect your ego or something like that, right? But it could underreport because, like, for instance, I'm not wearing it today, right? I forgot to bring my charger to Germany, so it doesn't work. So there are errors in both types of data. And so one of the things I'm really interested in is in combining those two sources to say, we've got two error-prone sources. The errors are really different in terms of their mechanisms. But if we bring them together, maybe we can get a third thing that is closer to the truth about someone's exercise habits or whatever.
Yeah, further questions?
No, I think that's
Last chance for you. Any further questions? Yes, please.
You also mentioned, or you talked a lot about documentation of surveys, but are there any, I mean, Henning mentioned the APO guidelines, which are really great in documentation. Are there any additional information besides those talked about in the APO guidelines that also should be or would be good to be documented, in your opinion?
I know that GASES like has a guideline series, but I'm not sure, right? So I'm not from GASES, so
they have actually a section that is called survey documentation, and there are also some documentation advice. And
actually, I used this for an online survey, and that was really helpful.
so they have like, it's like for an online survey, for instance, there's like at least 2 pages with different checklists and what to report, and yeah. Well,
also,
I think
the data processing issues or anything, challenges during the field work, how you try to tackle these. Something people could also look at is the open science initiatives. There's also a lot upcoming there with pre-registration standards, also describing your analysis, describing your sample. I think so. Maybe also closer to the interest of your study that you have talked is very important for data collection. And and I think in that sense, there could also be more documented before you actually look at the data.
So we have another question. So Klaus.
Okay. Hi, I don't know if you can hear me. Maybe. Hi. Maybe this has been answered before, but I didn't just get it. My question is about, I think, in the relation between prop and non-prop samples, there are different perspectives on about the role of the traditional surveys, the prop samples, in a way. My impression is one strategy is to go away from the non-prop stuff and the bad non-prop samples and invest in data quality. So maximize that, in a way, go in the direction of producing these benchmark surveys, so that we can use the non-prep samples in advantage together with the benchmarks, or give up on that because it's becoming way non-feasible in reality, too expensive. Just go in the direction of the non-prop samples and just make feasible samples. What are your idea? Would be your idea about this? Or is this just a wrong framework to think about this?
I think we're not in a situation like for the years coming that there's not one method that's going to work for everything. Like we're going to be in this kind of like limbo where the probability surveys are gonna stay kind of like, I think, for at least a while as being the gold standard. But non-probability surveys are also going to stay around, and it also depends on the question that you have and how much precision you need. And it's a very decision where to invest in or what to do for the particular research topic is, I think, quite complex. I don't have a ready-made answer to that.
I think there's a lot of research going on how to improve non-prob surveys, how to do rating techniques. There's a lot going on, but there's no gold standard around yet to make a non-prob survey reliable. But there's a lot of research, so I think we are going in both directions.
I think one problem is also with the non-prob surveys that where often the panels are often ran by commercial companies, and where some of it is also where market secret, how they recruit respondents, how they invite them, and so to have really high quality surveys that can be used for sciences, they need to be more openness regarding how everything is done, that people can understand what selectivities are in the sample, who has been invited to take part, and so on. So I think just if, for instance, scientists work together with those companies, or even some places like these have their own non-prob service, can also contribute to a quality development.